You are not immune to propaganda. Howdy friends, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new, welcome, and I hope you enjoy my content. Today I'm talking about Stranger Things 3, or my favorite season of the whole show, which seems to be a mildly hot take looking at the Rotten Tomatoes rankings. A very official way of judging the quality of something, I know. Now, there's a lot to unpack in this season, but I'm specifically addressing whether or not Stranger Things 3 is pro-capitalist propaganda. I originally got this thought from a Thought Slime video on a similar topic a long time ago that I'll link below. It's been about 5 million years since I've seen the video, so if I took something from it, then my bad. Great minds think alike, I guess. This seems to be a kind of divisive topic from what I was able to find, and I was honestly pretty shocked at the amount of articles that I found, and they were definitely interesting to look at. It seems that people are pretty divided on this aspect of the season, so I'm just gonna add my own thoughts into the mix. Keeping in mind that we don't have season 4 yet, maybe we'll get it someday, and apparently we're getting a season 5 now too. So basically what I'm saying is that my opinion is definitely subject to change depending on where the show goes. Also, there's going to be spoilers for the show. You've been warned. Anywho, I've got my fun 80s hair and makeup and a sweater that was my mom's in the 80s. So let's go! Obviously, we have to talk about the whole setting for the entire season, Starcourt Mall. It was clearly a ton of product placement, but you gotta pay the bills somehow, am I right? Look, I don't know much about 80s nostalgia since I wasn't, alive in the 80s, but it's clear that the mall is meant to be reminiscent of the time period, from bringing back chains that are no longer in business today, like Hot Dog on a Stick, to the signs of the department stores resembling what they looked like about 30 to 40 years ago. The mall represents the glitz and the glam and the rose-tinted glasses that many of us wear when it comes to the past, whether we lived in it or not. We have an entire montage dedicated to a shopping spree with Max at 11. Still one of my favorite parts, not gonna lie, but it does have the same vibe as an ad that we'd see today for like JCPenney's or something. It's clearly a hotspot for the town, with it always being packed with the people, and the traffic there is so heavy that it warrants its own bus stop. You could easily say that the mall and all of the customers represents how well people are doing in the town, almost as a case for how Reagan's trickle-down economics work swimmingly for the town. People are spending their money and contributing to the economy, and obviously that means his policies are working, right? All of these chains and big businesses surely mean nothing but good things for everyone. Because since when have large companies made things harder for small businesses? Oh, right. Yeah. Every single time. Look, if the Duffers wanted to keep their perfect little rose-tinted look into the past of how the 80s was, then they wouldn't have included some minute details about how Starcourt Mall impacted the town on a small business level. There are lots of details given to this, some larger and others smaller. Obviously, they didn't spend a ton of time on the way the mall impacted the economy of the town, since we were more focused on the big, giant monsters in the season. But the fact that they drew any attention to it at all shows an awareness that this time period wasn't perfect. The expansion of big businesses was not good for everyone. We can see a flyer detailing protests against the mall because of the harm that it's done to small businesses. And when Hopper is at said protest, we hear citizens of the town point out that it is because of Mayor Klein, who we'll come back to later, that they don't have jobs right now. It turns out spending money at Scoops Ahoy doesn't solve all of your problems. Shocker. They reiterate the plight of these small business owners a few more times. There's one time where Nancy mentions these complications with the mall only to be dismissed by the men in the writing room. Another point is whenever Hopper visits Joyce while she's working at Melvald's. She has so few customers that she's able to take a good chunk of her shift to give Hopper advice with Eleven, and even help him write out a plan and practice it and everything. It's clear that the business is definitely suffering for her place of work. She's probably lucky to have a job during that season. And let's not forget that in the end, the final battle of the season with the Mind Flayer takes place at Starkworld. It's the main setting of the season and is ultimately destroyed by the events that take place there. I'm not going to say that this is anything super deep along the lines of the destruction of the mall representing the destruction of capitalism or communism. I definitely won't say that the Mind Flayer is a metaphor for either of those things. If the mall is anything aside from a place to hold some really interesting action sequences during the battle, I would say that it might be the destruction of what people believe is a simpler time. People like to say, well, back in my day, things were better. Except they weren't all that much better. Not to say that they were like horrifically worse, although it was for a lot of minorities. But the destruction of a setting meant to encapsulate a ton of 80s nostalgia might point in a direction of realizing that those times might not be so great. Being younger meant that things were less complicated and didn't have as much nuance, but we have to take a really hard look at the past and notice that some things weren't all that great about the 80s. Or maybe it's just a mall and I'm digging way too deep. That's up to you. But speaking of being younger, let's discuss one of the youngest characters of the show. So it seems that a lot of people have thoughts about Erica Sinclair. I can't blame them, and I don't have any place in saying what aspects of her character are or aren't harmful with the way that she is currently written. What I will say is that she does definitely follow a sassy black girl stereotype, and that her opinions on capitalism are interesting. Let's also keep in mind that Erica is meant to be like 10, and that's not to bash on kids and their opinions and takes of the world around them, but like, do you remember some of those thoughts and opinions that you held when you were 10? Because I do, and I don't agree with a lot of them now. They were opinions that were based off of what my parents believed, the media that I was consuming, and a certain assumption that the world operated on more concrete terms than it actually does. I didn't see the nuance in situations, and I didn't have the knowledge and experience that I do now. And obviously Erica's a fictional character, and the Duffers could have done whatever they wanted with her. Maybe they just thought it would be funny to have some little kid own a few teenagers and say, "You can't spell America without Erica," and called it a day. But I'm not gonna do that, and I'm gonna dig a little bit deeper. There isn't a ton of canon information that we have about the Sinclairs on the show, and I'm about to be a frog over here because I'll be jumping to conclusions. Something that we know about this family is that Erica's dad fought in Vietnam, and that's because Lucas used a lot of his father's military gear from the war during the series. This is a war that's centered around wanting to curb the spread of communism. Obviously, there's more to it than that, but I think it's safe to say that Mr. and Mrs. Sinclair aren't going to be teaching their kids about the pros and cons of capitalism, socialism, communism, or anything like that. If it were to be discussed, capitalism would be seen as an ultimate good, and that's simply a hard fact that would be perpetuated to Erica between the Red Scare and her parents' values. She hears about a world where you are valued for the work that you give. It's all that she's ever known, so therefore it makes sense to her. Also, while she is part of a demographic that generally suffered under the Reagan administration, it's clear that the Sinclairs are a relatively well-off upper-middle-class family that likely would have seen minimized versions of those harms. Just because she displays an interest in politics doesn't mean that she has all that much awareness of the subject beyond what her parents talk about and what she sees on the news. This lack of knowledge becomes clear to me when she talks about the benefits of capitalism and specifically how it's better than communism. For example, when Steve talks about the lack of fire exits in the Russian base, she responds with how communists would obviously cut corners to save money at the expense of safety. Erica is 10, and I don't know what US history looked like in the mid-80s, but I know that I didn't learn about events like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire until I was in 8th grade at the youngest. You know, an instance where the US, a capitalist society, cut corners with employees by locking exits and stairwells just to keep workers from taking extra breaks, and subsequently causing the deaths of 146 women and children, as well as injuries to 78. And I know it wasn't until high school that I read an excerpt of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which depicted the meatpacking industry in all of its horror and worker violations during the early 1900s. Erica most likely doesn't know about these things. She's 10, and I doubt I knew anything like that at that age. There's a lot that I still don't know. What I do know is that the Duffers have done really good things with some of the characters in this series. There's 2 more seasons for Erica's character to develop, and with the way that society has changed in noticing systemic issues against Black people, I believe that there's a good chance it'll be addressed. If it isn't, well, season 4 has to, come out before I can cross that bridge. So, from a lot of the articles I've read for this video and some posts that I've seen since the season came out, most people aren't a huge fan of the Russians being the main villains this season, specifically in how they're portrayed. Now, I'm not Russian, so just like with Erica, I don't get to say what is or isn't definitively okay in terms of a portrayal of a group that I'm not part of. I will say that we shouldn't be surprised that the Russians eventually became the ones trying to get to the Upside Down this season. It's been alluded to since season 1 that the Russians were the ones behind the strange happenings, even if it ended up being the US government in the end. Also, there's been a sentiment of beating the Russians since the first season as well. 11 was originally intended to do things such as spy on Russians, which was how the Upside Down was discovered in the first place. It only makes sense that there would be competition between both countries to see what the Upside Down can do and what resources are there, if any. However, the way that they handled it did show a lack of depth and nuance that I do believe warrants the criticism I've seen. Making all of the Russians into these evil, bumbling caricatures does create for a weak antagonist. And yes, I know that the Russians aren't intended to be the main antagonists, but if they're gonna be pit against the characters that we all know and love, they should have been handled more carefully. All of the Russians, barring Alexei, have no real personality traits and are treated as disposable, which is seen when Hopper just massacres them upon arriving in the Russian base. This is something that I've seen criticized a few times and I believe is warranted, especially with the anti-Russian sentiment after the last couple of US elections. I am well aware that the Russian government doesn't exactly look out for its people very well and is pretty sketchy, but as an American, pot, meet kettle. Just because a government isn't great doesn't mean that its citizens shouldn't be granted some depth. This is something that I really hope the Duffers take into account going into the next couple of seasons, especially since it's clear that there will be Russians in season 4 at the very least. I think it might be interesting to see the main characters have to work with the Russians to close the gate and stop the Mind Flayer. Just an idea. Now, I obviously can't ignore Alexei, one of my favorite characters to watch this season. He obviously has more of a personality than any of the other Russians that we see in this season. I thought he was a really funny character, great comedic relief, and I just loved to see him. Though it is interesting that he's the only Russian character with a personality, and then proceeds to become Americanized in a way. He ends up loving slushies and Looney Tunes and wants to be an American so he can join in on the fun. And I don't know if this is meant to push an agenda, but it's something to think about. Though I think we should also consider Murray's lines as they get to the big 4th of July celebration, and Alexei seems to be entranced by the whole thing. He's shocked to hear that the big, bright carnival games are rigged, and doesn't believe Murray even as he tries to explain the games, saying that they have been designed to present the illusion of fairness, but it's all a scam, a trick to put your money in the rich man's pocket. That, my dear friend, is America. That's not exactly patting the back of capitalism, is it? Of course, Alexei ends up winning the carnival game and gets a gigantic Woody Woodpecker stuffed animal out of it and runs back to Murray, telling him that it's not rigged. Only to then be shot and killed by the Arnold Schwarzenegger stand-in. I feel like you can interpret that as Alexei almost winning in a way. He believes that he's far away from a government that killed one of his colleagues without a second thought, only to then be killed himself. So take that for what you will. I think something that a lot of people didn't think too much about was that just because the Russians were the ones pulling some of the strings this season doesn't mean that the general theme of distrust in the American government has to be tossed out. We still have themes of distrusting the American government in the form of, I think I mentioned him earlier. Do you remember when I mentioned that I would talk about Mayor Klein? Yeah, this is that part. The only reason that the Russians were able to get into Hawkins was because of the mayor of Hawkins letting them in the first place. An ambitious American politician was at the forefront of selling land to Starcourt Industries. He clearly does business with shady people and is willing to put his surface-level popularity and ambitions before the safety of his citizens. And he knows what he's doing. It's obvious when Hopper points out that the amount of angry small business owners could dampen Klein's odds for re-election, which he doesn't think too much of because he has a giant 4th of July celebration lined up to distract everyone from the real problems that Hawkins faces as a town. If there's anything that America has done to distract from some of its greater problems, it's large, flashy events and celebrations and parades. I feel like Mayor Klein ends up being a main reason as to why this season of Stranger Things does fall into the similar themes as it does in earlier seasons, with a focus on the class divisions in Hawkins and a skepticism of those in power. So, in conclusion, you are not immune to propaganda, and neither am I. There might be something that I missed in my reading and watching, but I do believe that with the way the show is currently, Stranger Things isn't pro-capitalist propaganda. It's easy to see such a thing on a surface level, but when you dig a little bit deeper, you can see that it encapsulates the capitalist ideals of the time period while still contrasting it with very real financial problems that certain characters deal with. And I know that this show isn't meant to be about capitalism or communism, but it's something that definitely cropped up a lot more in this season than any other before it. Who knows? Maybe I'll be eating my words 5 years from now when we finally get season 4. I'll gladly do so. Anywho, I'll link the articles that I read to prepare for this video down below. There are some contrasting views in there, and I don't agree with everything said in every single article, but I want to make sure that you have the same access to the things that I did, so y'all can form your own opinions. If you enjoyed this, I really hope you'll like this video and maybe comment your thoughts as well. I really enjoy Stranger Things and already have plans for more content on this series since, well, the Duffers aren't delivering currently, and I have a lot of takes on the seasons that are currently out. So if that interests you, or content along the lines of media analysis is up your alley, you should click that subscribe button and ring the bell so you can see what I come up with later. I hope you have a good rest of your morning, day, or night. Bye.